Everyone in the mahogany-paneled lawyer's office snickered when the executor handed Nathaniel a single rusted brass key. While his greedy cousins received millions in blue-chip stocks and sprawling real estate, he got a worthless heap of scrap metal rotting in a collapsed barn. But nobody is laughing anymore. Nathaniel Davis stared blindly at the heavy brass key sitting in the center of his calloused palm. It was jagged, coated in a thick layer of green oxidation, and felt entirely too heavy for its size. Across the expansive glass-walled conference room of Montgomery Hayes and Associates in downtown Seattle, the stifled laughter of his extended family echoed like a sharp slap across his face. Rain lashed violently against the floor-to-ceiling windows, perfectly mirroring the cold, sinking feeling in Nathaniel's chest. Beatrice Worthington, his cousin, adjusted her designer silk scarf and leaned back in her plush leather chair. She had just been bequeathed a staggering portfolio of Berkshire Hathaway stock and a sprawling equestrian estate in Aspen. "Well, Nathaniel," Beatrice purred her voice, dripping with a venomous kind of pity. "It seems Uncle Percival left you exactly what you are equipped to handle. A fitting legacy, wouldn't you agree?" Wallace Montgomery, the senior partner, overseeing the estate, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and cleared his throat loudly, though the smug smirk on his face betrayed his supposed professionalism. "As I was saying, Mr. Davis, the late Mr. Percival Davis explicitly stipulated that you are to receive the deed to the dilapidated barn on the southern edge of the Snoqualmie property, along with its sole contents, a 1958 Plymouth Belvedere. The remainder of the liquid assets, the Lockheed Martin pension, and the offshore accounts have been distributed to your cousins." Nathaniel closed his fist around the cold metal key. His knuckles turned white. He didn't care about luxury vacations or Aspen estates. He cared about the $85,000 he owed to Seattle Children's Hospital. His 7-year-old daughter Lily had undergone 3 intensive surgeries for a rare congenital heart defect over the past 2 years. The medical debt was a suffocating blanket, and the bank was already threatening foreclosure on his modest suburban home. He had attended this will reading with a desperate silent prayer that his eccentric reclusive great-uncle Percival, a man who had spent 30 years as a high-level aerospace engineer during the Cold War, might have remembered the nephew who actually visited him. Instead, he was given a pile of garbage. "Is there anything else?" Nathaniel asked, his voice barely above a raspy whisper. "That concludes the reading," Montgomery said, snapping the heavy leather binder shut with finality. "The property must be vacated and the barn cleared within 30 days before the new developers bulldoze the lot. I suggest you call a scrap yard Nathaniel. They might give you $200 for the steel." The drive out to the rural outskirts of Snoqualmie took over an hour, the winding roads, slick with October rain and fallen pine needles. Nathaniel's worn-out Ford pickup truck sputtered as it climbed the final gravel driveway toward the abandoned property. The main house, a beautiful Victorian structure where Beatrice would likely never set foot before selling it to real estate developers, loomed in the distance. But Nathaniel's destination was a quarter-mile down a muddy tractor path, an old sagging wooden barn that looked like it was one strong gust of wind away from total collapse. He parked his truck, stepping out into the ankle-deep mud. The air smelled intensely of wet cedar decay and damp earth. Approaching the barn, he grabbed a heavy iron crowbar from his truck bed and wedged it against the rusted padlock securing the massive wooden doors. With a sharp crack, the lock gave way. Nathaniel pulled the heavy doors open, the rusty hinges screaming in protest. Inside the barn was dark, cavernous, and choked with decades of dust. Shafts of grey daylight filtered through holes in the corrugated tin roof, illuminating the singular object sitting in the center of the dirt floor. It was a 1958 Plymouth Belvedere, or at least the tragic remains of one. The car was an absolute disaster. The once gleaming chrome bumpers were heavily pitted and flaking away. The iconic tail fins were dented, and the original paint, whatever color it had been, was completely swallowed by an aggressive cancer-like rust that covered every inch of the chassis. The tires were hopelessly flat, rotting off their rims, and the windshield was completely spiderwebbed with cracks. Rat droppings littered the hood, and a family of raccoons had clearly used the back seat as a latrine at some point in the last 2 decades. Nathaniel walked slowly around the tragic hunk of metal, the reality of his situation crashing down on him. This was it. This was his salvation. A car that wouldn't even qualify for a junkyard demolition derby. He kicked the front tire in a sudden surge of blind, helpless rage, ignoring the sharp pain that shot up his shin. "Damn it, Percival," Nathaniel whispered to the empty barn, his voice cracking. He leaned against the rusted door of the Plymouth, burying his face in his dirty hands. "What were you thinking? Why did you do this to me?" For an hour, he simply sat on an overturned wooden crate, listening to the rain hammer against the tin roof, drafting a mental apology to his wife and daughter. He would have to sell his truck. He would have to take on a 3rd shift at the manufacturing plant. They would lose the house by Christmas. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long, eerie shadows across the barn, Nathaniel finally stood up. He decided he would come back tomorrow with a rented flatbed trailer and a winch. Montgomery was right. The only value here was in the raw scrap metal. He reached out to test the driver's side door, grabbing the handle and yanking it upward. To his immense surprise, the door groaned and popped open. The latch, despite the exterior decay, was heavily greased. Nathaniel shone his phone's flashlight into the interior. The smell of mildew and ancient leather hit him like a physical blow. The dashboard was cracked, the radio was missing entirely, and the steering wheel was wrapped in decaying tape. But as he swept the light across the floorboards, something strange caught his eye, planting the first tiny seed of curiosity in his defeated mind. The next morning, Nathaniel arrived at the barn before the sun even crested the Cascade Mountains. The rain had cleared, leaving a biting, freezing chill in the autumn air. He hadn't brought the flatbed trailer. Instead, the back of his pickup was loaded with his heavy-duty mechanic's toolbox, a portable generator, a halogen work light, and an industrial angle grinder. He couldn't shake the memory of what he had seen the previous evening. When he had shined his flashlight into the gutted interior of the Plymouth, he had noticed a glaring discrepancy. Uncle Percival had been a master machinist, a man who worked on top-secret military aviation projects for decades. He was a man obsessed with precision, known for being incredibly meticulous, often to the point of severe paranoia. Yet the floor of the Plymouth Belvedere was horribly uneven. The passenger-side floorboard sat nearly 3 inches higher than the driver's side. Furthermore, when Nathaniel had reached down to pull back the rotting, moth-eaten wool carpet, he hadn't found rusted floor pans. He had found solid, heavy-gauge steel. Nathaniel fired up the portable generator. Its loud, rhythmic churning drowned out the quiet sounds of the surrounding forest. He ran a thick yellow extension cord into the barn, clicking on the halogen work light and bathing the interior of the ruined car in blinding white illumination. Climbing into the driver's seat, Nathaniel reached over the transmission tunnel and began tearing away the remainder of the ruined carpet on the passenger side. He used a sharp utility knife, slicing through the damp, moldy fabric and tossing it out the door. Once the floor was completely exposed, he stared down at the metal, his heart beginning to thump heavily against his ribs. It wasn't a standard automotive repair. Someone had cut away the original floor pan and welded a thick plate of brushed steel in its place. And the welds Nathaniel ran his gloved fingers over the seams were absolutely flawless. They were perfect uniform stack of dimes, TIG welds, the exact kind of high-level fabrication required in aerospace engineering. The steel plate was bolted down by 4 heavy titanium security screws at the corners the kind that required a specialized tamper-proof drill bit. "What were you hiding, old man?" Nathaniel muttered to himself. He dug through his toolbox, frustrated that none of his standard bits fit the unique star-shaped heads of the titanium screws. After 20 minutes of fruitless effort, he decided to abandon finesse. He grabbed his DeWalt angle grinder, fitted it with a fresh metal-cutting disc, and lowered his safety goggles over his eyes. He pulled the trigger. The grinder screamed to life, the noise deafening inside the small confines of the barn. Nathaniel brought the spinning abrasive disc down onto the first titanium screw. A massive shower of bright orange sparks erupted into the air, bouncing off the ruined upholstery and illuminating his intense, sweat-slicked face. The metal fought back thick and incredibly resistant, but Nathaniel pressed down with all his body weight. It took him nearly an hour of grinding, going through 3 abrasive discs to shear the heads off all 4 security screws. His arms were shaking from the vibration and exertion, his clothes soaked in sweat, despite the freezing temperature in the barn. Tossing the smoking grinder aside, Nathaniel grabbed his iron crowbar. He wedged the flattened edge beneath the heavy steel plate and pushed down with all his might. The metal creaked the tight vacuum seal, resisting his leverage. He repositioned his feet, took a deep breath, and threw his entire back into it. With a loud metallic pop, the heavy steel plate broke free. Nathaniel pried it upward and pushed it out of the car, where it landed in the dirt with a heavy thud. He immediately scrambled back into the cabin, shining his work light directly into the dark rectangular cavity that had been concealed beneath the floorboards. It was a custom-built, lead-lined compartment, and resting snugly inside was a large, military-grade steel munitions box, painted olive drab and sealed with a heavy rubber gasket. Nathaniel's breath hitched in his throat. He reached down and grabbed the iron handles on either side of the box. It was shockingly heavy, weighing easily 60 or 70 pounds. He heaved it upward, struggling to pull it clear of the compartment, eventually dragging it over the passenger seat and pulling it out of the car entirely. He set the box down on the dirt floor of the barn and fell to his knees beside it. The front of the munitions box was secured by 2 heavy latches. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. He snapped the first latch open, then the second. He grabbed the heavy steel lid and threw it back. He stared into the box, his mind instantly going entirely blank. The air seemed to rush out of his lungs, and for a terrifying second he thought his own heart had simply stopped beating. The box was neatly divided into 3 sections. In the first section, wrapped tightly in clear waterproof plastic, were stacks of pristine antique currency and documents. They weren't just standard cash. Nathaniel reached with trembling hands, pulling out the first bundle. They were United States Treasury bearer bonds issued in 1982. Each bond had a face value of $10,000. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Because they were bearer bonds, they belonged entirely to whoever held them in their physical possession. It was untraceable, completely liquid wealth. In the second section sat a row of 6 dark blue velvet pouches. Nathaniel opened the first one and tipped the contents into his palm. A heavy, magnificent gold watch slid out. He recognized the iconic crown logo immediately. It was a vintage Rolex, specifically a pristine 1968 Rolex Daytona with a rare Paul Newman dial-a timepiece that routinely fetched over $1 million at elite Sotheby's auctions. He opened the next pouch, a vintage Patek Philippe, reference 1518, perpetual calendar chronograph, an ultra-rare masterpiece of Swiss horology. Every single watch in the collection was a museum-grade treasure. But it was the third section that sent a sudden freezing chill down Nathaniel's spine, entirely overriding the euphoric shock of the immense wealth sitting before him. Resting at the bottom of the box was a thick, black, leather-bound ledger heavily embossed with the crest of the defunct Chase Manhattan Bank's private Swiss division. Sitting on top of the ledger was a crisp white envelope with Nathaniel's name written across it in his Uncle Percival's unmistakable sharp handwriting. Nathaniel wiped the grease and sweat from his hands onto his jeans. He carefully picked up the envelope, broke the red wax seal on the back, and unfolded the single sheet of thick parchment paper inside. My dearest Nathaniel, if you are reading this, it means you ignored the mocking laughter of your miserable cousins, and you didn't immediately sell the Plymouth to a scrapyard. It means you looked closer. I always knew you were the only one in this wretched family with an ounce of vision and perseverance. The wealth inside this box is now yours. It is more than enough to cure your sweet daughter, pay off your debts, and ensure your lineage never wants for anything ever again. But you must listen to me carefully, Nathaniel. I did not earn this money as an engineer. I acquired it during a very delicate, highly classified operation in Berlin in 1983. The bearer bonds and the timepieces were payment, but they were payment to look the other way, while something terrible happened. I have lived with the guilt and the paranoia every day since. Take the watches. Take the bonds. Liquidate them quietly through the contacts listed on the first page of the ledger. But whatever you do, Nathaniel, you must burn the ledger immediately after. They stopped looking for me a decade ago because they thought I destroyed it. If they find out the ledger still exists, the men listed on page 42 will not stop until they have it, and they will tear your world apart to get it. Protect your family, nephew, and run. Nathaniel slowly lowered the letter. The silence of the barn suddenly felt incredibly oppressive, heavy with a new, unseen danger. He looked down at the black ledger. He didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed at him to throw it into a burn barrel and light a match. But human curiosity is a dangerous, overpowering force. With a shaking hand, Nathaniel reached out and flipped the ledger open to page 42. He read the first name on the list, and all the blood drained from his face. Panic seized Nathaniel's throat as his eyes locked onto the black ink. Sitting perfectly on the 42nd page of the encrypted Swiss ledger was a name he had heard just 24 hours ago, Wallace Montgomery. Below the name was a detailed, chilling dossier. In 1983, Wallace Montgomery was not a pompous estate lawyer in Seattle. He was a junior logistics officer operating under diplomatic cover in West Berlin. The ledger meticulously documented how Montgomery had conspired with rogue factions to siphon millions in seized assets from East German defectors, laundering the illicit fortune through accounts at Pictet and Say, one of Switzerland's most secretive private banks. This stolen capital was the exact foundation upon which Montgomery had built his sprawling, untouchable law firm. Uncle Percival had not been paranoid. He had been a captive of a dangerous secret, and Montgomery had orchestrated this entire inheritance as a calculated trap. By giving Nathaniel the rusted Plymouth and demanding the barn be cleared for developers, within 30 days, Montgomery was ensuring the car would be sent to a scrapyard and crushed into a cube of unrecognizable steel, permanently destroying the only existing evidence of his Cold War treason. Gravel crunched loudly outside. Nathaniel snapped the ledger shut. He killed the halogen work light, plunging the barn into deep, heavy shadows. Peering through a gap in the rotting cedar planks, his stomach dropped. 2 matte black Chevrolet Suburbans were tearing up the muddy tractor path, their high beams cutting violently through the morning fog. Montgomery hadn't waited 30 days. He had sent a private security team to secure the property before Nathaniel could even organize a tow truck. 4 men stepped out of the vehicles. They didn't look like real estate developers. They wore tactical soft-shell jackets, heavy boots, and moved with the synchronized aggressive discipline of former military contractors. One of them pulled a heavy pair of bolt cutters from the trunk. Nathaniel had less than 2 minutes. Adrenaline flooded his system. He grabbed the heavy olive-drab munitions box, his muscles straining against the immense weight of the gold and bearer bonds, and hauled it quietly into the bed of his Ford pickup. He covered it instantly with a dirty, oil-stained tarp. He then grabbed the ledger, shoved it down the front of his jacket, and zipped it tight to his chest. "Check the perimeter," a gruff voice barked from outside. "Montgomery wants the vehicle tagged and ready for the flatbed within the hour. No mistakes." Nathaniel slid into the driver's seat of his pickup. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely slot the key into the ignition. He knew he couldn't hide. The barn only had one exit, and the Suburbans were blocking the primary path back to the main road. He took a deep breath, picturing Lily's face. He thought of her hospital bed, the endless beeping of the cardiac monitors, and the suffocating medical bills. He was not going to let a corrupt lawyer take his daughter's future away. Nathaniel turned the key. The Ford's V8 engine roared to life, with a deafening, throaty bellow that rattled the decaying tin roof. "Hey!" one of the contractors shouted, dropping his bolt cutters. "Someone's inside!" Nathaniel slammed the shifter into drive and floored the accelerator. The rear tires spun wildly, kicking up a massive spray of wet dirt and debris before catching traction. The heavy pickup truck burst through the partially opened barn doors, shattering the rotting wood into a shower of splinters. He didn't aim for the tractor path. Instead, Nathaniel jerked the steering wheel hard to the right, plunging his truck directly into the dense, overgrown brush of the Snoqualmie forest. Heavy pine branches whipped violently against his windshield, cracking the glass, while the truck's suspension bounced aggressively over hidden rocks and fallen logs. "Get in the vehicles! Go!" he heard a voice scream from behind him. The chase was chaotic and brutal. Nathaniel navigated the treacherous, uneven terrain purely by instinct, relying on his knowledge of the rural logging routes he used to hike as a teenager. Behind him, the roar of the Suburbans echoed through the trees, their heavy frames smashing through the undergrowth as they desperately tried to intercept him. But the heavy armored SUVs were too wide for the narrow, winding deer trails. Nathaniel hit a steep embankment, his truck launching momentarily into the air before slamming down onto a paved county road. He fishtailed wildly tires, screaming against the wet asphalt, before he finally gained control and sped towards the interstate, leaving the ruined contractor vehicles trapped in the dense mud of the forest behind him. 3 days later, Wallace Montgomery's private glass-walled conference room at Montgomery Hayes and Associates felt less like a sanctuary of corporate power and more like a pressurized containment vessel. Rain battered against the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, weeping shadows across the imported mahogany table. Montgomery sat rigid at the head of the room, his expensive silk tie suddenly feeling like a hangman's noose. His normally arrogant face was splotchy, a sheen of cold, clammy sweat coating his forehead. Sitting directly across from him, looking entirely out of place, yet completely in control, was Nathaniel Davis. Nathaniel was no longer wearing the grease-stained denim from the will reading. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal grey suit he had purchased off the rack that morning, though it hung slightly loose on his exhausted frame. Resting squarely in the dead center of the vast wooden expanse between them was a single laminated sheet of paper, a high-resolution photocopy of page 42. "I truly do not know what kind of elaborate game you think you are playing here, Nathaniel." Montgomery stammered, his voice lacking its usual booming, authoritative baritone. "This document is a blatant, ridiculous fabrication, a pathetic forgery cooked up by a paranoid old man whose mind was thoroughly ruined by Cold War propaganda years before his heart finally gave out." Save the theatrical performance. Wallace. Nathaniel replied, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. I spent the last 72 hours executing an unbreakable contingency plan. The original ledger is currently resting in a biometric safe deposit box at a private vault facility in Geneva, Switzerland. Furthermore, I paid an independent cybersecurity contractor to set up an automated dead man's switch. If I do not enter a unique passcode every 24 hours, an email containing high-resolution scans of every single page will be sent directly to the Department of Justice, the IRS, and the investigative desks of 3 major international newspapers. Montgomery swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing painfully. The deafening silence in the room stretched out heavy with the crushing realization that a billionaire power broker had just been utterly outmaneuvered by a desperate, grieving father. Montgomery knew the names on page 42. He knew exactly what the East German Stasi and rogue intelligence operatives would do to him if that ledger went public. The federal prison sentence would be the least of his worries. He would be hunted. "What is your price?" Montgomery finally whispered, his shoulders slumping as he dropped all remaining pretense. "Name the sum. I can have it wired to an offshore holding account by the end of the business day." "First," Nathaniel began, leaning forward and steepling his fingers, "you are going to permanently call off your private security thugs. If I ever see a matte black SUV parked anywhere within 5 miles of my family, or if someone even looks at my daughter the wrong way, that automated email goes out instantly. Second, you are going to initiate a wire transfer of $4.5 million. But it won't go to me. It will be deposited directly into a designated philanthropic escrow account to establish a permanent pediatric cardiology research wing at Seattle Children's Hospital in my daughter's name." $4.5 million, Montgomery gasped, gripping the edges of the table until his knuckles turned white. "That is outright extortion, Davis." "No, Wallace," Nathaniel corrected sharply, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "That is merely the overdue interest on the blood money you laundered through Pictet and Sier in 1983. Consider it a mandatory charitable donation to clear a fraction of your miserable conscience. And third, you will sign over the deed to the Aspen Equestrian Estate, entirely free and clear of all liens and property taxes, directly to my name. Beatrice can find her own vacation home." Montgomery stared blankly at the laminated photocopy, his mind racing through potential loopholes and counterattacks. He found absolutely none. Cornered and thoroughly defeated, the senior partner reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a heavy gold Mont Blanc fountain pen, and dragged a stack of real estate transfer documents toward himself. "You are making a remarkably dangerous lifelong enemy today, Nathaniel." Montgomery muttered bitterly as the nib of his pen scratched aggressively across the signature lines. "I survived a lifetime of poverty, and I survived your hit squad," Nathaniel replied, standing up to collect the signed paperwork. "I'm not afraid of a coward in a suit." 6 months later, the stress of Seattle was a distant memory. Nathaniel found himself standing beneath the chandeliers of the Phillips auction house in Geneva. The room was packed with the global elite oil magnates, tech billionaires, and royalty, all murmuring quietly as they studied their auction catalogues. Famed auctioneer Aurel Bax stood at the elevated wooden podium, expertly guiding the room through a frenzied, escalating bidding war. "We are currently at 2.8 million. Bax announced, his voice echoing through the velvet-draped gallery. "Do I hear 3 million from the gentleman in the 4th row?" "Thank you, sir." 3.2 million from the phone desk. 3.2. Nathaniel watched with a quiet, steady smile as the hammer finally fell on lot 42 Uncle Percival's pristine 1968 Rolex Daytona with the ultra-rare Paul Newman dial. The final hammer price, including the buyer's premium, settled at a staggering 3.5 million Swiss francs. And that astronomical sum was just for the first watch out of the 6 hidden inside the munitions box. The bearer bonds had already been quietly liquidated, cementing a fortune that would last for generations. Stepping out of the auction house and into the crisp, freezing alpine air, Nathaniel pulled his smartphone from his pocket. He ignored the notifications of massive wire transfers hitting his newly established private banking accounts. Instead, he simply stared at his lock screen. It was a photograph taken just 2 weeks prior. It showed his beautiful daughter Lily, her cheeks flushed with vibrant color. She was laughing hysterically, running freely across the sprawling, snow-dusted green pastures of their newly acquired Aspen estate, completely unburdened by the tubes monitors and medical equipment that had anchored her for so many painful years. Uncle Percival had left him a rusted, seemingly worthless heap of scrap metal. But hidden deep beneath the dirt, the rust and the cruel mockery of his greedy family, Nathaniel had found exactly what he needed to rewrite their destiny. He had driven out to that collapsed barn, looking for a few $100s in scrap iron, but what he actually found was pure salvation. Wow, what an incredible journey, from a rusty scrap car to uncovering a multi-million-dollar Cold War conspiracy. Nathaniel risked everything to save his daughter and outsmart a corrupt billionaire. If this hidden treasure story had you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button and share it with a friend who loves a good plot twist. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life mysteries and underdog victories.